How do we reduce the risk of injuries in junior athletes? My name is Angie Jackson, and I was once that young injured athlete. And I've spent the last 30 years working as a physiotherapist, trying to work out why some kids get injured and yet others don't. I'm also the mum to two international athletes, and that's given me a great insight, not just as a physiotherapist, but also working out how to juggle the busy lives of these student athletes. I've worked across many sports and across many sectors, and hopefully I can share some of that experience with you now. When in the school year do the highest number of non-contact injuries in children occur, do you think? Well, the answer is the first 3 weeks of the new season or term. But I want you to think about why that might be. Because if we start to understand the why behind injuries, we stand a much greater chance of being able to reduce them. They occur when we exceed the body's current capacity. And this can be a very sudden event, or it can be a gradual process like you can see in this rope. And so we can look at this slide and think about injuries occur when we exceed the current capacity of the body. And I really want you to home in on that current capacity. And that can either occur when the load is increased beyond the current state of the tissues. So maybe that's like a spike in activity, or perhaps they've tried harder, so the intensity is more demanding. Or alternatively, what we're aware of is that their capacity can be reduced, perhaps illness, lack of sleep, stress, or other factors that we'll consider shortly. So injuries and illness occur not with doing too much. That's what we were always told, wasn't it? Children do too much, but that's not true. It doesn't make any sense. They occur because they do too much too soon. If we consider how many athletes of all ages can do incredible feats, they can do these ultra marathons, but as long as they plan for it and they build up the training gradually, the body adapts to that and it just gets stronger and stronger. So it's really important that we consider this planning for training, and that might help us to boost our capacity. So for a minute, I want you to just perhaps stop this little video and just think about what might cause an increase in activity in your child's world. So think about the calendar year. Think about maybe the start of a new term, and think about all the different things that they want to pack into that new term. What might cause a sudden spike in activity or intensity of activity? So I really want you to join in with this and make this interactive. So spend a few minutes just thinking about all the different things that could occur. Well, how many of these did you get? So after those long summer holidays, perhaps the child goes back to school and starts doing all sorts of different activities in week 1. Or perhaps they've come back after injury or illness, and that's caused a big spike in activity relative to what they've been able to do. But there's many other factors as well, like pre-season training camps that are often on back-to-back days where the child's not done anything for 6 weeks and then suddenly are thrown into high-intensity fitness campaigns. And then we've got those early parts of the season where perhaps other sports haven't yet finished, so those seasons overlap. We've got situations where maybe the child goes to a new school, or perhaps they try out a new sport, or they've perhaps got a new coach, and all of that might result in a real change in stimulus to the body that the body's not used to. We can see that within equipment changes, where perhaps the child moves up to a heavier cricket bat, or perhaps they have a heavier tennis racket. And so there's so many different factors that we need to consider. And the weather can wreak havoc with regard to causing a massive calendar congestion when we see perhaps towards the end of a term or a season where fixtures have been postponed due to adverse weather, and as a result of which we get more than the usual volume of fixtures in 1 week. So we keep coming back to this. Injuries occur when we exceed the capacity of the body. So we've just considered the role of sort of load or volume or intensity that can happen and its impact on the capacity of the tissues. But now we also need to think about what types of factors might reduce their capacity. And so it brings us to that question, why do some kids get injured with the same amount of activity? Imagine that this group of children were all in the same class at school and they all went to the same football club. And basically they all do the same amount of training. And yet they won't all get injured in that third week of the term. Some will, some won't. But importantly, that helps us to really start to recognize maybe it's not just all about load. Perhaps there's some other factors that are relevant as well. So for a moment, just consider why certain days we seem to have more energy than on others. And this applies to adults as well as to children. Some days we just feel like we could run forever, jump forever, and when we go to the gym, we're full of beans. And yet on others, we seem really exhausted, really flat, and really tired. And that would impact how hard we would give a score to a certain session. So if we ran for maybe 5 kilometers, on one day, we might mark that as a high effort, whereas on another day, we might say it's a moderate effort. So why do we have more energy on some days than others? Think about the things that affect you. And have you ever considered whether those might affect your child? The ones I've come up with are here. And these are what we call the risk factors effectively for childhood injuries or young athlete injuries. And these are what we call the risk factors for young athletes getting injured. So maybe we need to think about their growth spurts during periods of illness. And does that impact their sleep? Or is that perhaps linked to stress, exam periods? Perhaps the calendar's got really congested and they're doing too much too soon with too little recovery. But there's other things that can affect what we need to think of as their battery. If we don't give them enough energy intake, then the battery will drain faster. And certainly those athletes that are stronger seem to have more resilience to different spikes in activity. And then we need to think about, in certain parts of the world, things like low levels of vitamin D and perfectionism. What's their attitude and their self-talk? What's their mental health like? Because all of this is going to affect our battery. So there's lots of these things that we can explore, and we'll touch on just a few of these. So I often think about children just getting too little recovery. That doesn't mean they need total rest days, but they can't go hard every day. And we need those recovery days. They're when we recharge the battery. That's the days when the muscles go, gosh, if they're going to do that again, I'd better lay down some more bone or some more muscle and make myself stronger in case they do it again. And so we need to think of our 4 R's: repair and grow, rehydrate, rest and recharge, and refueling. So when kids are going through growth spurts, we know that during that time, that as the bone length increases, the bone density decreases. And as those bones get longer, it will actually place more traction on the points of attachment of the muscles onto the bones and cause ultimately a reduction in flexibility, but also a loss of coordination. But we don't need to power down all kids. We don't need to stop them all doing exercise during growth spurts. What seems to be the case is those who grow faster and those who grow over more than 7 centimetres in a year seem to be more susceptible to injuries. Or maybe it's just those kids who take greater risks, the kamikaze kids who seem to throw themselves into everything. And certainly stress has a massive impact on our capacity. We know that from our own work situations. We know that it can affect our decision making, our concentration, our muscle tension. We feel more tense, and that might impact our coordination. And certainly we're more susceptible to getting things like colds when our stress levels are high. It affects our vision. Our peripheral vision isn't as good when we're getting very stressed. And certainly the irony is often when we need sleep most, it's when it's at its most sparse. Because if we're really anxious before we go to sleep, it often affects not only the ability to go to sleep, but sleep quality. And ultimately, these higher stress levels not only reduce the child's capacity to do more, but it also impacts their performance. So I mentioned briefly there in the list of different risk factors that is the child getting enough vitamin D? And we know that we get that from the sunshine. The problem is that we have a duty of care to make sure that we put sunscreen on kids, because ultimately, whilst they may have a reduced capacity, they may get more injuries and they may get ill more, they're not going to die of any of those factors. Whereas if we don't protect their skin, ultimately we may see that they get skin cancer. So the important part here to recognise is that we can't always get enough vitamin D through sunlight with children. And so there are also certain athletes who are indoors a lot, like gymnasts and swimmers, who won't get any exposure to sunlight. So it may well be worth either getting your child tested by their general practitioner or giving them some vitamin D supplementation, particularly during the darker winter nights. And a critical aspect of how much capacity the child will have is the same as within your car. If we don't fuel it for what we do, then it's going to break down. So my question would be is, does your child eat enough for the amount of sport that they do? Do you ever consider that how much they might do on each day might differ, and therefore the amount of fuel that you give them might differ? So how many children do you think don't eat breakfast? Importantly, does your child eat breakfast? Because this is one of the most important meals of the day. They won't have eaten for maybe up to 12 or 13 hours from the night before. So sending them to school without any fuel is likely to lead to poorer concentration, but also create a spike in injury risk. And so they need to eat the right fuel at the right time. And for children with small tummies, that's little and often. And we can find ourselves, if we are in this negative energy balance where we're not eating enough for what we do, having something called low energy availability. What we put in isn't enough for what we do. And so effectively, we may be firing not fully on empty, but just not on adequate energy for really good performance and for maintenance of wellness. So we can get either unintentional or intentional low energy availability. And the unintentionals are very much around perhaps a parent doesn't realize just how much energy a growing young athlete might need, particularly the boys as they're going through those growth spurts. And we know that playing high intensity sport needs more energy than perhaps some lower intensity or lower volume sports. And certainly in vegan children or children who maybe have to miss out on food groups due to things like lactose intolerance, and even just school meals can end up meaning that children just don't get enough during the course of a school day to fuel them for what they do. And that may be combined with children who are fussy. Perhaps certain children don't like certain textures of food, or they don't like certain, maybe they've chosen to miss out certain foods because they don't like them. There's so many reasons why unintentionally the child might not get enough for what they do. But sadly, there are also children who intentionally have a lower energy intake than others, and perhaps than they might need. And this can be for a broad number of reasons, from weight categories that we see in things like boxing or the martial arts or rowing, where children, and in horse racing we sometimes see it as well, where these athletes have to make certain weight categories, and there's a temptation then for them to end up fasting or perhaps not taking on the fluid that they need. And there's been all sorts of fairly poor practices across junior athletics and sport in the past. And hopefully most of this now has been highlighted and eradicated. But it's worth being aware that maybe a more old-fashioned coach might still have some practices that aren't healthy and could put the child at risk of injury by trying to encourage them to meet certain weight categories. And then we can see that different sports have used things like weighing and caliper testing to see how much fat the child's got, with a view that perhaps traditional beliefs were that in certain sports like running, maybe it was thought that being lighter was faster, but that just doesn't stack up. It's not faster to have low energy intake. You won't get the muscle buildup. You won't have the energy to run fast. So we've hopefully eradicated many of these beliefs, but still some coaches will persist in fat shaming children and causing really unhealthy relationships with food. And again, a lot of the governing bodies are really working hard now to minimize the chances of a child being weighed in public or any of these different body tests that can be done. So hopefully you shouldn't get any experience of that. But if you do witness it, it's certainly worth discussing it with the coach, because we don't want these children to get a poor relationship with food. And then you've got those that perhaps are like your gymnastics, or I think Tom Daly's talked about it in diving, whereby children feel they've got to be a certain shape or a certain size or a certain weight. And it's incredibly important that parents have very sensitive discussions with their children about this and make sure that they avoid any even teasing. Girls, when they go through their puberty, will tend to put on quite a lot of weight before they then lose that over the next 6 to 12 months. But it's massively important that you realize this is just a part of normal hormonal development and is needed to fuel bone health and muscles. So it's not something we should be worried about in these young athletes. So there's all sorts of peer pressures, coach pressures, social pressures. There's the whole social media things of the type of pictures and images they're being exposed to, but also what they put on their social media feed. And we've got to make sure that children understand, in order to perform well, to stay injury free and to stay well, they need to make sure that they're getting adequate energy for what they do. And this can really manifest itself if the body doesn't get enough for what it does, then effectively it will go into fight, fright, flight. So just consider for a moment, when this lion is about to chase these zebras, what systems does the zebra need in order to survive? So when we're threatened with danger, we're threatened with stress, the body's got an incredible coping strategy. It can divert energy to where it needs it. But importantly, if it doesn't think it's got enough energy for what it needs, it's got all sorts of strategies in place to make sure that the essential systems are supported. So if we think for a second about when this zebra needs to run away, it needs its heart, it needs its lungs, it needs its muscles and its senses. But does it need to digest its breakfast? Does it need to reproduce? Does it need to lick its wounds and boost its immunity and do all those growing of muscles to make them stronger? Well, no, it doesn't. So effectively what happens is that the energy gets diverted to where it's needed most. So that's the hearts and the lungs and the muscles. But it starts to divert the energy away from things like digestion and repair and immunity and reproduction. And that can create a massive cascade of hormonal responses, which ultimately can lead to injury. And how I describe this is rather like a phone going into power saving mode. We know that when the battery is drained, the phone doesn't work optimally. And so we can explain this to children, that when their phone is in power saving mode, it makes certain decisions for you about where to allocate that last 10% of battery. And it will make sure that you can still make phone calls. It will make sure that you can still text, but it won't allow you to play on games or videos. And so effectively, it saves the energy for what it needs most. And that is exactly how the body works. And when we start to see either short periods or even chronic periods of low energy availability, the impacts on so many different systems is immense. We start to see that our bones become more vulnerable to stress fractures. We can start to get recurrent infections. Our cardiovascular health and our reproductive function over a longer period of time can be adversely affected, and this can affect us for life. And certainly we can start to see changes in mental health. In the boys, we start to see low libido and their motivation may drop for a sport that they've previously loved. Their sleep quality may get affected and they start to have that lack of concentration. But critically, they get a drop in performance. So let's just think about what would happen if we noticed a drop in performance. As a parent, what might you do if your child suddenly stops performing as well as they were? Perhaps in something like a swimmer, we might see that they're not reaching their personal bests. Perhaps you can just see observably that they're not doing as well as they were. And there's many reasons for this. But the problem is that if the child sees that they're not performing as well, maybe they just try harder. Maybe the parent adds some extra coaching sessions in for them. So let's just think for a second about these blue, in the top diagram there, these blue rectangular units. And think of those as maybe a swim or a run, or for yourself, a gym activity. And what we would expect is if we do more sport, we'll get fitter. But the only way that will occur is if we get adequate recovery. And that red line is equivalent to our recovery periods. So think of that dotted horizontal line as like our baseline of fitness. We do a unit of sport, and providing we get that red line recovery that goes above our previous baseline level, we get a little bit fitter. And then we do another unit of sport, and provided we get that recovery, there's a gradual increase in fitness occurring. You can see that other blue line steadily climbing. But unfortunately, what can happen if we start ramming more sessions together, we try harder, and maybe we're still not getting adequate fuel for what we do? And then what happens is the recovery never quite has time to get back to baseline. And so we start on this slippery slope, this yellow line, where we're getting a downturn in fitness, a downturn in performance, and ultimately this vicious cycle where they keep trying harder, but without recovery and without the adequate fuel, they just start getting less and less able to perform. And the increase in injury risk and illness rapidly follows. And one of the terms that's been associated with this low energy availability, what we call relative energy deficiency in sports, but it does apply to non-sports. It applies to those artistic gymnasts. It applies to the ballet dancers and many other environments as well. But critically, this relative energy deficiency in sports is now well recognised by governing bodies of many different sports. It's been part of a consensus statement within the International Olympic Committee, and you can find that and all the infographics at this British Association of Sports and Exercise Medicine site. And there's lots of great resources, a lot of them at this Red End Sport. Is another great site that I'd encourage you to go and seek more information if you're worried about your child not getting the energy for what they need. Kidsbacktosport.com is a website where parents and coaches and practitioners can go to get more information about how to keep kids injury free and how to get them safely back to sport when they're injured.